At this point, I would like to remind you of the final section of our abstract for this talk. We write, our attention falls to the inequitable effects of concepts as we wonder, what might the ecological study of concepts do to the ecological performance of concepts? Two intertwined mass extinctions are underway as habitats and human language are lost to the world due to invasive concepts. Countering these mass extinctions might mean practicing concept de-extinction, seeking out endangered concepts for in situ and ex situ conservation, as well as Deleuzian concept creation. It is to the concept of political ecology we turn, as the term is an exemplar of conceiving myriad ways of being. Indeed, we can say that multiple ecologies exist in the day-to-day lives of earthly beings, and we can speak of each as having a politics, or a way of relating, which prioritises certain engagements over others. Jacob von Auxell's tick has an ecological politics of odour, temperature, and hairless skin. Its ways of being, the biosemiotic signs it is capable of reading, the ontological possibilities which are dictated by the ontological landscape which is open to it, are not too dissimilar to the multiple ecological, multiple political ecologies forging the paths of people. In this way, concepts retain politics whilst becoming organismal. What our abstract is in fear of is the ecological politics of political ecologies, of how some political ecologies run riot over and dominate all others. Introduced as invasive concepts, fostered as monocultural conceptual plantations, put to work to weed minoritarian political ecologies, which may be deliberately targeted and or simply ignored, trampled, or left to wither in the ruins of majoritarian political ecologies. Capitalist political ecologies, fascist and authoritarian political ecologies of indifference, fear, and, worryingly, political ecologies of transcendent and universal nature. Indeed, the majoritarian concept of ecology itself. The effect is a suppression and annihilation of pluralized ways of being. A heterogeneous ecology of political ecologies is diminished as languages and the ontological ways of being their concepts facilitate, and indeed necessitate, are lost. This then brings us to what might be done to increase concept heterogeneity. Our first suggestion is countering these mass extinctions by practicing concept de-extinction. In traditional conservation, de-extinction, also known as resurrection biology or species revivalism, is the proposed act of bringing a species back from extinction through either cloning, genome editing, or selective breeding. In conceptual terms, we might look to human history to understand different political, ecological concepts which have informed past ways of being. We might look to archaeologies of knowledge, or anthropologies of now lost peoples. Something to be aware of, however, is that the frames of inquiry used within works of this nature from which we might draw do not themselves perpetuate homogenizing political ecologies. An example here is the work of Tyler, whose classification of animism as a base religion was itself a result of his own culture's bifurcated conception of reality. In contrast, the work of Noritberg David and Tim Ingold, for instance, has done much to offer new conceptions or political ecologies of various animisms, whereby the process of living is conceived as highly relational and immanent, as opposed to Tyler's initial transcendent depiction. Of course, these animisms, and all political ecologies, whilst hugely damaged, exist to certain extents within the world, with the lives of indigenous peoples, to whom we will return, but also more marginally in the ordinary experience of settler colonisers and Westerners. It would be a mistake to conceive of various political ecologies as parts of a greater category or delineated set. Rather, we should think of them as what Bergson and Deleuze call a multiplicity, where the emphasis is not on what type of political ecology we are witnessing or living, for we are all living many constantly, shifting and fusing with each other, but on the intensity and effects of our concepts. The focus is on what our conceptions do as they are lived. A central question is which concepts to choose for de-extinction. Following our broad push towards a plurality of political ecologies, we advocate a sort of spontaneous conceptual rewilding in which we seek out concepts which might themselves help to increase conceptual plurality, egalitarian and cosmopolitical concepts. Our second suggestion is to identify endangered concepts for in situ and ex situ conservation. We might at first consider this approach as strongly aligning with established practices of language preservation, including recording and education. However, we also perceive this alignment as raising questions about the locations of concept conservation. For instance, the critique of recording languages for language preservation is that they remain on recording devices within institutions, in no way living the ontological landscape they themselves would infer. This would suggest a preference for in situ concept conservation. However, as with the general politico-onto-ecological understanding forwarded in this paper, we can see the apparent divide between in situ and ex situ concept conservation as a false binary. For instance, whilst academic labours, such as this paper, and peer-reviewed articles might be perceived as ex situ, they can act as a primer and work to disseminate and forge new realities for those reading or hearing them. Rather, this type of work can be more usefully perceived as always practical and educational, and again, we should look to a plurality of spaces for its realisation. Examples abound in decolonial and indigenous studies, but we need much more of it. And besides, Indigenous studies is not merely about conservation, perceived as holding and perpetuating the past. It is critically about speculative futures. With this in mind, to our last theme, Deleuzean concept creation as a speculative and creative practice. Deleuze is well known as the philosopher of the event and of concept creation. In fact, Daniel Smith notes how Deleuze's concepts are themselves always becoming, shifting in nature and morphing to and with the situations they interact with. We believe this is true throughout the practices of concept conservation we discuss above, and that rather than thinking of concepts as having identities, we can think of them as taking place as they are put to use. As instigators of these practices, we might look to the concepts created in egalitarian philosophy, for instance feminisms, decolonial subaltern studies. But we might also look to speculative fiction and the realms of the alien, the magical and the fantastical. In truth, none of these approaches to concept conservation should be seen as having solid identities, and neither should what we have described be read as a set of instructions, although we have used both identity and instruction in our language. We don't really think there should be an international union for the conservation of concepts established, where concepts are ranked in terms of their vulnerability. Concepts can be conceived ecologically, but this is a performative ploy to prompt thought, rather than solely a call for preservation and protection. Rather, we suggest considering what this presentation has done, if anything, to our own political ecologies and to the ontological landscapes they infer.